Hello, everybody. Welcome to this session. This is a session focusing on the work that the EU Open Science Policy Platform have been doing over the past 4 years, and focusing on thinking about open science and going from recommendations to practical implementation. My name's Rebecca Lawrence. I'm Managing Director of F1000 Research Limited. I was a member of the policy platform and editor of the final report. I'm delighted to be joined today by a really prestigious panel of speakers, all of whom were members of the Open Science Policy Platform. I will introduce them in more detail later, but briefly, we have Michaela Bettira with us, who is co-founder of EU Life. We have Lydia Borrell-Damian, who is the Secretary General of Science Europe. We have Ava Mendes, who has been the chair of the OSPP and represents the YERUN, which is the Young European Research Universities Network. We have Ian Moss, who's a Chief Executive Officer of STM, which is the International Association of Scientific, Technical and Medical Publishers. And we have Cohen Vermeer, who is past co-chair of the Global Young Academy. Today's session will focus on providing initially an overview of the Open Science Policy Platform, and Ava Mendes, our chair, will provide that summary and explain about who we are, what we were trying to do, what we were trying to achieve, and really, what our work has been over the past 4 years. I will then provide an overview of the final report that came out back in May and take you through the key points. And then we'll move on to a panel discussion with all the speakers, where each of the speakers will provide initially a short summary of their key perspectives from the report, and then we'll move on into a discussion. I encourage you all to add in your questions to the speakers and the panelists throughout the session, just adding them in through the chat function, which will enable us to have a really good discussion, hopefully, later on in the session. And then Ava will provide some concluding remarks. So I will kick us off now with the initial overview from Ava Mendes. And just to introduce Ava, Ava is currently Deputy Vice President of the Scientific Policy and Open Science at Universitat Carlos III de Madrid, and a member, as discussed, of the European Open Science Policy Platform representing YERUN. And she's been our chair for the second mandate of the platform for the past 2 years. She's been an active member of several international research teams, advisory boards and communities, including OpenAir, Metadata 2020, RDA, and many others. In November 2017, she was named Open Data Champion by Spark Europe, and she holds a PhD in Library and Information Sciences and is an expert in metadata. So I will now pass over to Ava.
Okay, thank you. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure for me to be virtually interested today, as you can see from my background. I have the pleasure to introduce you what we have been doing in the Open Science Policy Platform during the last 4 years. I was only the chair in the last 2 years, but I can just tell in a bit what we have been doing. What I said that is modeling open science in 4 years by stakeholders. What I want to tell you is who we are, why we are in this group of people working on the policies and advising the Commission and the Commissioner Moedas on open science, and what we have achieved at a point that we can influence other stakeholders out there. This is the group of people, 25 members, 8 groups of stakeholders, and we have an amount of incredible, committed and knowledgeable people that they belong to these stakeholder groups, universities, research organizations, academies, funding organizations, citizen science organizations, publishers, platforms, and libraries. And over the time, we have changed a bit the people, but not the institutions that were represented in the platform. All the institutions represented in the platform have a pan-European coverage, and they have something to say related to the policies of open science. This was the scenario, the state of play when we started in 2016. The Commission put us, the Open Science Policy Platform, in the center of a lot of workflows of communication about policies on research, policies on publications, policies related with the open science movement at the moment in Europe. And we have the committed endeavor of address at least all these European open science challenges that we have been working over the 4 years in all these topics. And also we have different high-level groups that give us an input in some specific points of these challenges. That was very, very interesting, because these enlarge the community of the members also in the high-level expert groups in different teams. This was more or less the scenario that we were having after the first and the second mandate. We have our own Open Science Policy Platform recommendations, OSPP REC, but we were surrounded about all these recommendations, policies, advice, different analysis studies done by high-level expert groups in the 8 challenges. So, but at the end, what we want to do with our recommendations was having something like an overview of addressing all these different challenges through the stakeholder level, each of us, of the stakeholder that we represented. These are the pillars or the 8 challenges or the building blocks, because in open science in Europe, the most challenging thing is that the building blocks are at the end the big important topics that we have to address. But we agree that the most important one was the rewards and incentives, is the bottleneck that having always avoiding open science to flourish. But anyhow, we did recommendations at a horizontal level in every single challenge at the level of the stakeholder group that we are representing. But in the second mandate, we want to go further on the recommendation mode, is what I call, we want to move forward the declaration mode to the implementation mode. Not more recommendations, no more declarations, just we wanted to have an action plan. And the action plan was kind to align our open science policy platform objectives, challenges, recommendations with a real implementation in the scenario of our stakeholder group. So that's why we define what we call the PCIs, which is part of the final report, is what we offer to the public, is the practical commitments for implementation. And these practical commitments for implementation are mainly commitments. It's something that you can do in a committed way, addressing one of the challenges or several of the challenges of the open science. They have to be realistic and affordable. It's something that you have to have jurisdiction. For example, during the panel, you will see that we represent different institutions. For example, I was representing in the platform the Young European Research University Network. I have jurisdiction in that group of young universities. I cannot change the open science approach of the academies of science. I cannot change the open science approach in the publishers. I have to have jurisdiction. And also these PCIs, they have to have an implementation. They have to have an effect. It's more or less to pass open science to action level, which is something that we all want to do even today, when we have done a lot of things, but still we need to have a practical implementation. And all these PCIs and all these practical commitments for implementation was in our final report, which is the one that Rebecca will present you deeply, because she was leading the whole writing process. And in this final report, we try to address what has been the progress on open science in the last 4 years, addressing different implementation, different challenges in an implementation mode. So this is more or less what we have done in these 4 years. I don't want to spend a lot of time on telling you details of all these implementation and all these challenges. It was a real pleasure to chair this group for the last 2 years of the mandate with such a commitment and such a interest for all the stakeholders involved in the platform. So I will just hand over to Rebecca, that she will just go deep in the final report, which is the final outcome of what we have been doing in all these 4 years. Thank you.
Thank you, Ava. Thank you for the very helpful summary. I will now start to take you through a summary of the final report. Okay, so I will take you through the key points that we came to in the final report. Obviously, I can't go through all of it, just as Ava commented as well, but I will focus on those key elements and also really what we were aiming to do with that report. So I'd say there were probably 2 key elements that we were focusing to do here. One was to review progress against the previous report that we delivered in May 2018, which was a combined set of recommendations, as Ava just commented, across the 8 pillars of open science as defined by the Commission, and to really look at where progress had been made, identify exemplars of those progress and of those practical commitments of implementation that Ava just discussed, and also to identify blockers to progress, where areas hadn't moved forward as quickly and why that might be. The second part of the report was really to try and provide a vision going forward and really thinking beyond just open science, moving much more to a shared research knowledge system by 2030. So I will take each of these areas in turn. So looking at progress against the OSPP REC, which is those initial recommendations that we published back in May 2018, those recommendations, just as a brief summary, essentially provided 2 to 4 recommendations against each of those 8 pillars. And what we tried to then do is identify out of the 9 stakeholder groups that we have here, recognizing that not every stakeholder that's involved was included, but this was including the areas that we represented on the platform, looking at which are the key groups that we felt could make the most progress on each of those recommendations. And as you can see from the screen grab, the sort of layout in terms of being able to easily see those. So looking at that progress since May 2018, I think there were three sort of main outcomes that we summarized in the report. The first was around the call and upcoming creation of a registry of pilots and implementations of responsible metrics. And I will explain more about that in a second. The second was that the increasing appointment of open science coordinators and task forces for the implementation of open science. And the third was a collated series of practical commitments of implementation. And I will just go through each of those briefly. So the registry of pilots really came about, as Ava just pointed out, that we felt that really to achieve progress in open science, that it's crucial that we address the point around research assessment and around research evaluation and rewards and incentives for researchers. Because if we don't address that, it will be very hard to really make progress in these different areas. We felt there's already an awful lot of frameworks out there, in fact, for responsible use of metrics. Paul Wouters and colleagues last year produced an excellent expert level report around a series of frameworks for responsible use of metrics. And that really built on a number of other significant reports, such as the Metrics Tide, Leiden Manifesto, and many others that have looked at this. So we felt there were already the frameworks there. There are already actually examples of contextualized and responsible use of metrics around the world. And DORA, the San Francisco Declaration of Research Assessment, in particular, has done quite a bit of work in trying to collect some of those examples. And they come from funders and institutions and societies and others. But although there are those sort of few pockets that we could see, we felt that really to take this to the next level and to drive uptake, what we need is to call on more new pilots and policy implementations and to openly share the learnings of that. Because a lot of the feedback we heard in terms of what was stopping organizations and communities from starting to adopt some of these metrics was just even trying to work out how to start and wanting to see examples of how one might do it in their particular scenario. So we have been working with the RDA, who are also a member of the Open Science Policy Platform, and who've we're very delighted that have agreed to coordinate together with DORA and indeed many other organisations to help create this structured and searchable registry. And the key thing here is that it is structured, and where possible, we'll use ontologies to make sure that there is structure in the information there, and that it's searchable, so that users can come along and look for examples that are similar to their situation and understand what others have done. The idea is that people register their pilot. So they come in and they say what it is and what they're going to do and how they're going to track it, etc. And then provide a commitment to come back 1 to 2 years later and report on the outcomes, both whether positive or negative, but so that we can really analyse and understand what's been learned from that pilot or indeed implementation. It's obviously crucial that we have an open evaluation of those pilots and open dissemination of the results so that we can support uptake and broader adoption. The second element was around open science coordinators and task forces, and the OSPP REC called for the appointment of national coordinators and task forces for the implementation of open science around Europe. And in fact, since 2018, there have now been many national coordinators appointed, and many member states have also developed national open science plans, for example, in Finland, in Ireland, in France, and elsewhere. In October last year, 21 of the member states brought representatives together as part of the Finnish EU presidency to create what is now CONOSC, which is the Council of National Open Science Coordination. And the aim of that group really is to both fill in gaps in national open science coordination across the European research area, but also to provide some insight into activities that are going on to support others and to enable each to learn from each other and support that shift in adoption, and also to ensure links with other international parties and partners that are working towards this. The third part was around reviewing those recommendations at the level of each of the actors within the system, capturing example practical commitments for implementation against each of them, categorizing progress so we get a general sense of, are we still at the starting point, or are we much closer to adoption, and then identifying blockers. There were a whole series of areas where there was reasonable consensus, I would say. Rewards and incentives, the research indicators and metrics, future scholarly communication, EOSC, and fair data. There was general consensus that we were at least at the implementation stage, and actually with fair data, I think most groups felt we were moving towards adoption and maybe even becoming common practice. But interestingly, there were three areas where there was real disparity in the different actors' view as to how much progress we had made. And those three were research integrity, skills and education, and citizen science. And so it tended to be those organizations most tasked with providing progress in each of those that felt that significant progress had happened, and indeed that we were at sort of adoption level, whereas most of the other organizations and communities felt that actually we were potentially still back in the discussion and planning stage and maybe in implementation. And so there was a real disparity for each of those. I think there were sort of three key points that came out from that. One is that if we're going to have real progress, particularly in those three areas that I just talked about, we need to have constructive dialogue between the different stakeholders so that we understand each other's perspective and understand where this disparity in view is coming from, so that we don't end up with, inadvertently with polarization or indeed some kind of blame between the different groups. It may be simply that either that we have a different view in terms of what progress looks like and where we're trying to get to, in which case it would be good to come to a common view on that. Or it may be that indeed progress has been made, but the communication of that has not been effective enough, and not everybody's aware of that communication. The second thing that I think came out quite strongly in those discussions is the need, and I would say urgent need really, for debate and discussion between academia and industry regarding open science, because most of the discussion really is focused around academic research, and of course industry has many other different challenges, and we need to make sure that we come to some discussion and agreement as to what open science means and how industry can engage effectively with open science, particularly given the number of public and private partnerships that we have, to make sure that researchers and others don't get caught in the middle. The third thing I think that came through was a need to develop a framework to ensure that by having more open diffusion of knowledge, which we all think is generally a good idea, doesn't inadvertently disadvantage those that are already, in fact, underprivileged. And so it's really important that we think about, the unintended consequences of some of this. There is a full list and report of the practical commitments of implementation and blockers by each of the actors in the report. And so if you go to the report, there's a big annex which details all of this, but obviously I won't go through that here. The second part of the report was looking forward and thinking about a vision for moving beyond open science towards a shared knowledge, research knowledge system by 2030. And there were a number of points that I think were the background for this. One is really that I think everybody feels that open science is progressing slower than maybe anticipated, and certainly there are obstacles, I think, that remain to enabling progress. One of those is around disparity generally in progress and motivations across different disciplines and institutions, actors, and even researchers at different career stages have a really different motivations, and these need to be aligned in some way. There's also, I think, a lack of policy alignment across different jurisdictions, all the way from locally to regionally, nationally, and indeed internationally. And of course, that causes real challenges in that research really is an international and very often a collaborative endeavour. And so this lack of alignment causes real problems for researchers on the ground. And then I think there's probably insufficient cost-benefit analysis work that's been done on open science requirements, which makes it difficult to really make more rapid progress. Another point was really that open science isn't an end in itself. And, we've focused across Europe and indeed in many parts of the world on really trying to shift towards open science. And I think we felt that in some cases, maybe the reason for why we were shifting may be getting lost. And really, to enable real progress, people need to understand why we think this is a good thing or why this actually helps the bigger picture. And so we wanted to bring it more into context of where we're trying to go and why this is of benefit and why the different elements of open science are of benefit. I think, obviously the power of having opened up science and sharing knowledge and collaboration that's been demonstrated, through the work that's done, particularly in relation to COVID-19 research and the significant acceleration of progress that's been demonstrated for that, hopefully demonstrates, very effectively some of the huge benefits that can be gained from working in a much more open science and open research way. But I think we felt obviously it's very important that we now leverage those collective benefits and we do learn lessons from it and don't just slip back into the old ways of doing things. And we use this opportunity to make more structural changes to the research system so that all science can advance more rapidly, not just when we have emergencies, for the benefit of everybody, indeed for research and indeed for society as well. And so we called on sort of European member states and other relevant actors to co-create, develop and maintain a research system based on shared knowledge by 2030. So what does that mean? We felt there were 5 key attributes to that. The first was an academic career structure that fosters outputs, practices and behaviours to maximise contributions to a shared research knowledge system. Secondly, that we create a system that's reliable, transparent and trustworthy. That we have a system that enables innovation, that we create a culture that facilitates diversity and equity of opportunity, and finally create a research system that's built on evidence-based policy and practice. So just briefly taking each of those in turn, so looking at the academic career structure, the idea really would be that researchers need to be empowered by a reward system that encourages them to collaborate and share their work, and encourages them to be creative, but also honest and transparent, and support them in taking responsible risks and not feeling that there will be overly negative consequences in doing so. Also that the different actors involved in the system need to explore new ways of motivating and evaluating researchers and institutions, and indeed their contributions to the knowledge system, bearing in mind that, no one size fits all. And actually, different disciplines, different communities, different size groups, all sorts of different contexts need to be taken into account. And indeed, decision makers at different levels need to try and align as much as possible those different elements. Secondly, was around reliability and trustworthiness of research outputs. And really, this is essential, and essential indeed to speeding up research progress. It's such a crucial element to research, but actually, interestingly, not commonly used directly in research or researcher evaluation. Obviously, there are codes of conduct out there, but we felt that there was limited data on whether they improve research practice or indeed are being adhered to or enforced. There's obviously a lack generally of publication of null, negative and inconclusive results, and it's well known this can create publication bias. And so we felt, it's important that good research practice encourages and incentivizes the sharing and indeed requires the sharing of those kind of findings. And then we felt that member states really need to coordinate a series of workshops to develop, test, and then share a minimum set of community-based standards of research integrity, and then ensure there's adequate training, support, monitoring, and enforcement of those standards at publicly funded institutions. The third one is around enabling innovation. We need clear policies to increase the availability and reuse of research knowledge and technology in a global competitive context. We need a global interoperable infrastructure of tools, services, hardware, and software. Obviously, we have things like the European Open Science Cloud that goes some way towards this, but it's important that actually this is, it moves to being on a global level, and there's interoperability around the world, because as mentioned before, research is global ultimately. And we need around that clear regulatory frameworks to manage each of the stakeholders' interests in the collective good. It needs a transparent competitive market to go with that, and we need a system that's based on reciprocity. In terms of the research culture, we need a system that's open and equitable to everybody, not only in terms of accessing and reusing knowledge, but also in being able to contribute to it, both in terms of publication, but also in terms of access to tools and technologies to enable contribution to that system. This obviously needs to transcend, you know, all the sort of different elements, from disciplines to organizations, culture, politics. And we need everybody to collaborate to create a set of values for such a system, with a legal and social framework around it, with which those values can be implemented. And then finally, that we need to think about how we fund and support researchers, how researchers publish and review findings, and how we incentivize the research system. But we need to do it based on evidence, and we need to, you know, have a better understanding, I think, in terms of when new ways of working are effective and should be changed, and indeed when they're not effective, and learn from that as well. And I think we felt there's plenty of meta research out there, but I think there's a real lack of translation of that into policy. And I think we need more meta research, because it makes it very hard to deliver a consensus on where we're heading, what actually this new open future looks like. I think we all agree that that's where we want to get to, but I think we all potentially have different views as to what actually that should look like. And so we felt we need a coordinated strategy for funding and delivering a programme of research on research, including identifying priority areas and involving representatives from key actors across the system. So that's a short summary of the report. Actually, the core of the report isn't that long, so I would encourage you to have a look at it. So there is a big annex, as I mentioned earlier, which has much more detail in it. I'd like to thank Ava Mendes, particularly as the chair for the second mandate of OSPP, but also all the authors and all of the policy platform for helping to put together this report, particularly during quite a challenging time for everyone, obviously with the surge of COVID, and also to thank the EC's Research and Innovation team for all their support, especially Jean-Claude Bergelmann and René von Schomburg, and of course more recently Kostas Glinas as well. And you can obviously access the report from the EC's site. So that's a summary of the report. I will now move us to the panel discussion. As I mentioned before, please do add your questions about the report, or as the panelists now go through, and I've asked each of them to give a short summary as to what they felt from their perspective and from their community's perspective, the key takeaways from the report. But please do add in your questions so that we can have a lively discussion afterwards. So I will now hand over to Michaela Bitiro, who's going to give her perspective from the report. Just to introduce Michaela, she's head of international and scientific affairs at the Center for Genomic Regulation in Barcelona, with a mission to strengthen the international interdisciplinary dimension of the Institute, focusing on strategy, science policy, and international collaboration. She's currently coordinating the European project Orion on open science, and she was instrumental in the creation of the EU Life Alliance, which she's been representing as a member of the OSPP. And she has a background in biology with a PhD in genetics. So I'll now hand over to Michaela.
Good morning, all. It's a pleasure, it's an honor to participate to this ESOF session on the OSPP work. And these last 4 years of OSPP have been really rewarding, also generating new friendships. So in these very few minutes, I will present you the ULife perspective on the OSPP report. But first, let me share in brief what ULife is about. So ULife is an alliance of 15 leading research centers in life sciences. And we share the values of quality, integrity, ethics, social responsibility, as well as openness. And we want to be a voice in European science policy, but also to develop and share together good practice and expertise in research and in management. So the next slide is about the ULife PCI, the practical commitment of implementations from ULife along the 8 priorities. And I used some traffic lights to show a little bit the status of progress. The yellow means in development, and the green at the full speed. So regarding rewards and incentives, quality of research comes first at all ULife institutes. In general, there are defined career paths. And I think it's important also to highlight that there is recognition when it comes to evaluation, a diverse range of outputs from the faculty, including participation to exploitation activity, teaching, supervision, or science communication. Regarding next generation metrics, again, quality over quantity. All ULife institutes adopt international peer review, including experts in different fields. And interestingly, some are trying experiments to evaluate the societal impact from fundamental research, which is one of the characteristics of ULife. Regarding open access, most institutes have institutional open access policy. Most of us also, they don't have libraries, but we do have access to collaboration with university or national repositories. And we also use international repository like PubMed Central. And we observe an increase in preprint publishing using the bioRxiv. In EOSC, because as we are running relevant facility, database, and repository, we participate on the technical level. And fair data is definitely an area of work at full speed, developing guidelines, tools, training, and also creating new professional profiles like data stewards. And since, as I mentioned, we don't have libraries, most of the time these efforts are taken by core facilities, our technology platforms. Citizen science, we are experimenting in different projects. Rebecca mentioned the H2020 Orion Open Science Project. I'm coordinating together with a few ULife institutes. And the area of skills, it's definitely another area of flourishing, of training at different career stages on open science. And finally, research integrity, as I mentioned, is one of the core value of ULife. And then all institutes have codes of good scientific practice, policy in case of suspected misconduct, as well as training and lots of awareness activities. As mentioned in the report, of course, there are blockers or challenges. Maybe here highlight the one that we feel are very relevant for our constituency, for our alliance. As recognized in many different fora, not only here, there is a cultural challenge, especially in the evaluation and reward system. And also in terms of there is a need for more funding, but also resources. So infrastructure, but also skills, stuff that can tackle the new challenges in open science. Here we want to highlight also that now we are also witnesses we are a bit overwhelmed by open science initiative tools and platforms. So there is also a need to harmonize, define some standards or what really works. And the other things we want to highlight, it's important a global change. So science is global. So open science need to go viral worldwide. It's not that we can have specific changes in Europe or in US because there is a need for a global collaboration. And finally, this is the last slide, the way forward. So we fully embrace the vision of a shared research knowledge system as presented in the OSPP report. I highlight here as 4 of the priorities we want to work on within our alliance. So research evaluation, we want to share good practice. Maybe also we said that we value quality over quantity, but sometimes we know there is a sort of implicit impact factor bias, so maybe work on this. Data management is a very complex and interdisciplinary issue. So we are, for example, organizing workshops to work on policy, training, implementation. Citizen science, it's more common and more present in some fields than in others. So we want to experiment also different way of public engagement. And we agree with the report, it's important also to promote diversity and equity in a very broad sense. And maybe just I would like to take the opportunity also that from ULife, we would like to advocate for a new stakeholder platforms on open science for Horizon Europe. Maybe a different format, maybe broader, but we believe, as also Rebecca mentioned, it's very important to continue this dialogue among different stakeholders for policy and development as well as implementation. And with this, I would like to thank you. I will lead the words to the next speaker.
Thank you very much, Michaela. I'm going to pass over now to Cohen, who I will introduce. So Cohen Vermeer is research professor at the French National Research Centre and the University of Paris. He's a theoretical physicist who turned historian and philosopher of science, and he's interested in exploring the science-society policy nexus. Cohen's just finished a term as co-chair of the Global Young Academy, which is a science academy for early career scientists that is recognized worldwide for its scientific quality and a strong commitment to service. As co-chair, Cohen strove for a more inclusive science ecosystem and aimed to empower young scientists globally. He also works as an editor advisor with the European Commission, several science academies, UNESCO, the UN, and other national and international organizations. Cohen's also an editor-in-chief of the journal Centaurus and directs the book series Techna. So over to you, Cohen.
Thank you, Rebecca, for this introduction. And hello, everyone. Good morning. Thank you to the organizers of the panel for inviting me to speak here at the OSPP panel at ASOF. And I would really like to express my warmest appreciation to my fellow members of the OSPP for the collaboration over the last few years, which I think was really constructive and also very enjoyable at the same time. Rebecca and Eva already mentioned some of the results, most notably the OSPP recommendations from 2018, the new registry for pilots, and also, of course, this final report. But more importantly, I think, than these results was the process by which these were achieved. And I think really what was so extraordinary about the OSPP was that it was a platform, it provided an opportunity for different stakeholders to really engage and to sit together and to learn about each other's perspectives, concerns, and needs. And I really think that was the strength of the platform. And I think that's also nicely recorded in the final report. While the recommendations 2 years ago were focused on consensus, this report allows for different perspectives on where we are in the implementation of open science and different aspects of that. So it shows where the different stakeholders think that we are right now, but it also shows a disparity of views. Rebecca already mentioned a few elements, for instance, on research integrity. We have quite some different views about where we are. There are also some consensus areas, but maybe even there may be more disparity than we might think. And it's actually on that disparity, these different perspectives, that I would like to focus today. Because I think the report has two sides, or it can be read in two ways. One is that it allows for this disparity, but on the other hand, of course, it also presents a closure. It's a closure of the OSPP time. It's the closure of the OSPP as a project. But I think it should not be read as if something that is finished. And while the last section even already looks beyond open science, I don't think we should take that to mean that we should already go beyond open science or that we are ready with open science. Because I think that would be really dangerous to think that there is closure on open science, because that would really hide the real difficulties faced by scholars and young researchers in particular. And so at the OSPP, I represented scientific societies and academies, but today I would also really like to bring the perspective of young scientists to that debate. And I would like to highlight the real and everyday problems that my colleagues are facing. And so I can tell you many stories about this, and people email me virtually every day about their concerns. For instance, recently someone from India saying that her article was accepted in a prestigious journal, but she couldn't pay the open access gold fee. Someone from France complaining about new rules that he's not allowed to publish where he wants, people fearing about their tenure review, and actually someone wanting to make her results, her data open, and threatened by the PI for wanting to do that, because that would amount to stealing data of the group. And I can also tell personal stories about my struggles with the journal and to make it open, just to highlight that there is still major challenges ahead of us. And in our OSPP report, we talk about rewards and incentives and the future of scholarly communications. And these are in the implementation or adoption phase. And I think that's true for some of the stakeholders. But again, I think it's really important to see these different perspectives, because implementation and adoption means very different things for the different stakeholders. For instance, of course, a policy can be seen as implemented or being adopted when the policymakers are finishing the new rules or when people are thinking about communication of the new policy. But that also means that from the other end, in this case on the researcher end, it's far from being common practice. It's far from being adopted. Many people are only just hearing about the changes, and they are only just starting to worry about what is happening, and about there is the fear and confusion is actually just starting. So despite of a lot of progress in the whole system, of course, it's only when we go to implementation and adoption, when, so to speak, the rubber really hits the road, that the real life problems start arising and that the challenges become clearer. So I would like to stress that our OSPP report is not the end of something, but I really see it as the beginning of what we still have to do. And from the, so I would also really like to call for this continued engagement between the stakeholders. And I think that feeling, that sense was really shared by everyone, by all members of the OSPP. That was so valuable, and that we want to continue that conversation. So even if the OSPP won't continue to exist, I think it's very important that we continue to find other ways to engage and to be able to talk to each other. So just to end on the young scientist perspective, I would like to highlight that with ideas of implementation and with adoption of new policies, I think we should think about monitoring of the effects of and trying to better understand what is happening. And so I'm very happy that Coalition S actually accepted our suggestions to create a monitor to look at the effects of Plan S. And I think that idea should actually be implemented much more broadly to see what is happening on the floor, what is really happening with the researchers in their laboratories, in their lives, and to continue to listen to the voices of young scientists. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Karen, for those great points. Thank you. Okay, I'm now going to move on to Ian Moss and ask for his comments. So Ian Moss joined STM back in December last year as Chief Executive Officer. Prior to this, he was Director of Public Affairs at the BPI, which is the British Recorded Music Industry. Ian's also spent 12 years in the UK government and was a senior civil servant, serving as Director of Criminal Justice Strategy in the Ministry of Justice, Head of Strategy in the Department of Work and Pensions, and Principal Private Secretary at the Cabinet Office. Prior to this, he was also a researcher in Parliament for a government minister and worked in the office of Tony Blair during the 1997 election. So I will now hand over to you, Ian. Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca. And thanks to all the contributions, and thank you for inviting me. I really want to welcome the work of the panel and particularly thank the authors of the final report and Rebecca and Eva working together on such a, incredibly large commitment. It's And I have to say that it was a tribute to their diplomacy to pull together very different perspectives in a shared report. And that we have a joint report is an extremely important marker, I think, in our joint commitment to open science. And we publishers want to be a strong and willing partner in collaboration to this goal. So it was very important, I think, that we got involved. As Rebecca just outlined, I came to post very late in the process, so I can claim little credit for the report. But I thank those whose efforts I now represent, really. At the outset, I think there's an important point made in the summary, which I very much welcome, is that there needs to be a more extensive, in-depth discussions between communities to better understand the different opinions and the desire to have an open and constructive dialogue. As it says, I think for real progress to happen, there needs to be a constructive dialogue, and this panel is part of that. And the points Cohen just made, I think we need continually to evaluate, to understand the impact, and to monitor, and all that talk about the incentives and so on is an understanding of that situation where we have to make sure that there is an understanding of the effects of all of our policies and our progress. STM greatly valued the opportunity when selected as one of the experts, and we hoped and expected a constructive dialogue as we had, although we also, let's admit, expected at times that discussions would be challenging for the published community. We are deeply committed to serving research and the goal of open science, but we will continue to have to make the point that the transition has to be sustainable, because the role publishers undertake is an important part of the verification of science, and a significant cost goes into the early stage of selection and work on submitted manuscripts that sometimes is not recognized. I think we need to make the point that if intermediation and verification that currently publishers undertake, although we are by no means the only part of the system that does that, if it wasn't there, we would have to invent it. And all of our experience of the online revolution has shown that there is a very real possibility of diminution of quality of evidence, trust, of verification, of facts, as received by and believed by and communicated by the general public, decision makers, journalists, people outside of the system. And we have to really understand our relationship between them and us, and maintain and build into all of our processes the need for research to be verified, peer reviewed properly, and mandating that these are made. The simple fact is that there is a great cost to the truth. And I think this report and the contributions so far are really clear that this is an exercise in improving science and not in cutting costs. And we need always to build those bits into the system and ensure that they're still there, because there's one thing we've learned from 20 years of observation of the internet is that facts struggle to find a voice. I'd also draw attention, I think, to the final sentence on page 3 of the report, which is that open diffusion of knowledge should not disadvantage players that are already underprivileged, and again, going very eloquently put some of the problems and some of the individual cases and anecdotes that he has heard. And we have to be very careful about how well-funded areas of research in wealthier nations and regions may pursue a course of action that will discriminate against those disciplines that lack funding for publication, those countries where research funds are not freely available, and people, of course, at earlier stages of their career. Publishers need to be able to select and publish the best research, the best science, throughout a researcher's career, from wherever it comes. And we have to be able to do that on terms the researcher can access freely and openly. And it is ultimately the wishes of researchers that will shape the system and publishers' response to it. And funders are an important part of shaping that system. The incentives are an important part of shaping that system. But ultimately, we have to understand that the researchers own their thoughts and their research and their decisions on what they want to do that are important to understand and engage with. So any strategy to further progress of open science needs to recognize the role, I think, that that scholarly publishers undertake to advance science and health and innovation. And particularly, I draw attention to the role of the scientific societies. Their work, the work of our members includes managing the peer review process, revision and copy editing, preparing manuscripts, creating extensive links to related research outputs, providing electronic and print distribution and public communication of findings, ensuring discovery and deposit into long-term archives. And it includes support for research communities and scientists, and a focus on developing their skills and the skills of future generations of discovery and innovation. That said, we are not a homogenous membership. All of our members of responses will be very, very different, and they are all adapting and competing and innovating to serve the move to open science. And Rebecca's company here, it's part of one of our members, is a great example of that. And we should allow room for the endpoint to evolve, whilst ensuring that we continue to maintain the important functions, because there will be many, many different ways of delivering our objectives here, and we need to let those thrive and have opportunities. Moving on to the concrete actions, though, and I think the practical commitments for implementation seem a very promising way to address the challenges in the open science environment. And I think the openness with which we and the report has accepted that there are challenges. There are going to be bumps in the road, and we need to work together on these. And I think, that said, discussions on Ambition 3, the future of scholarly communications, were pretty challenging for publishers. And I think we need and want and will maintain a dialogue that needs to be not fixed on prior beliefs. We have to look at our objectives and work towards them without coming to the table with an answer. And the question needs to be driven from the perspective of the need for production of high quality content and how to ensure the long-term and continuous investment for that. So there was no consensus reached on the integrated advice of the recommendations on the future of scholarly publishing. And with this in mind, we'd like to see an honest dialogue as to what's needed to reform the publishing system whilst ensuring the high quality of content is guaranteed. So considering the different ambitions for publishers, Ambition 2, indicators and research metrics, Ambition 5 on fair data, and Ambition 6 on research and integrity, all very high interest and importance. These are areas where STM publishers can actively contribute to the progress of open science. And so we will concentrate on how we can build on our ongoing efforts and follow-up commitments. The outcome of the practical commitments for implementation on fair data confirmed that STM, with our 2020 research data year, are moving in the right direction. We've been a keen and active participant and important initiator to advance data sharing and address researcher needs. And a focus of the STM 2020 research data year is to support the efforts of researchers to share, link, and cite their research data. We'll work with researchers, funders, and repositories on their data needs and how best to handle data, including working within the Research Data Alliance. And in the context of STM's research data year, we really reinvigorated our ties with the Research Data Alliance, which has been extremely positive. And we welcome all of that close cooperation. This has been an excellent process. It's looked at some of the barriers. We need to ensure that we build resilience in the system to mitigate against the downsides. For all the positives, our experience of online has shown that you need to start with systems that protect and mitigate against any downsides and understand the potential risks. Trust in science will depend on a continuing system of verification, signals of high quality, ways for people to navigate through the vast amount of research that's created, functions that our membership currently undertake. And to this end, I think that we all agree that the attributes of the system that the report outlines summed up on page 4, and Rebecca outlined them earlier, are extremely important. To paraphrase, shared knowledge, reliable, transparent and trustworthy research, innovative research, fostering diversity, equality of opportunity, and evidence-based. And we need to live by those conclusions and genuinely, honestly test propositions for change long-term against them. And with that, I'll hand back to Rebecca. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ian. Thank you. Okay, I will move us swiftly on because I want to make sure we've got a good length of time to have a discussion at the end too. So I want to pass over to Lydia Borrell-Damian, who is Secretary General of Science Europe, which represents the major public organisations that fund or perform excellent groundbreaking research in Europe. Prior to this, she worked for the European University Association, where she most recently served as its Director of Research and Innovation. And her experience really covers a wide range of EU research and innovation priorities, from EU Framework Programme, European Research Area, research infrastructures, ethics and integrity, and many different areas. And Lydia holds a doctorate in chemistry. So I will now pass over to you, Lydia.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much to all the previous speakers for the excellent points on the open science policies and actions towards open science. I would like to join the other speakers in thanking Rebecca for her excellent job in bringing all of our views together in the report published in May this year. And I will also extend my thanks to the former chair of the OSPP platform, Johannes Vogel, and of course to Eva, that has been driving us in this interesting process from the last 2 years. I would like to perhaps focus on 3 takeaway points regarding key areas that we have identified as barriers or very challenging to move on towards open science. And who are we? We are Science Europe. This is an organization composed of research performing organizations and research funding organizations across Europe, from 28 countries in Europe. And we are managing all sorts of processes fostering the research, the conduct of research at national level, but also at European level. In the framework of the Open Science Policy Platform, Science Europe has been active from the very beginning through Professor Matthias Kleidner. And then former Secretary General Stefan Kuster and myself have been also active members in the OSPP. The takeaway points that I'm going to highlight go fully in line with these 5 attributes that are in the report regarding a research system based on shared knowledge by 2030. So the first point of attention perhaps is the timeline. We are aiming at 2030, which is a way to be conscious that the processes that we are trying to drive, inform, assist are long, because everybody wants to move on safe steps to cause as little discomfort as possible. Let me put it that way. So my 3 points refer to, first, approaches to research assessment for project selection and career progression. Second, standards in the research data management. And third, the need for monitoring the implications of open science policies, which into one way or another, other speakers have referred to. But I will present key points towards coherent frameworks across Europe. That's what we are trying to do. For example, in tackling the way research funders and research performers tackle research assessment exercises for project funding or career progression. We published in July this year a fair amount of policy recommendations based on assessment processes already well established in those organizations to support the improvement of those processes in the current context, and to promote the sharing of knowledge to enrich the capacity of better assessing capacity of national and international research exercises, research association exercises. There are a number of recommendations that I will not go into detail. I highly recommend you to read this report and use it as a reflection for your own circumstances. What I would like to highlight is that beyond metrics, 81% of the surveyed organizations include qualitative assessments, according to data from 2019. And one major recommendation is out of this report is all the analysis is that the evaluation processes should focus on research content instead of metrics, or at least put metrics into a relative position so that the content is starring in the assessment process. There are many examples already in Europe pioneering this type of initiatives. Let me just highlight the examples of SNSF and Switzerland, where they have a new standardized CV structure to facilitate the work of applicants to present their contributions in a narrative style beyond metrics. Or the case of the NWO, the research funding agency in the Netherlands, that has introduced in their own way a narrative format. It's called this appealing name, Vidi Vinci, to improve the assessment quality. We have closed this project in June, as I said before, and we will now engage in a follow-up project where we will look at the rewards and incentives from researchers in a perspective of the changing science culture. And we can talk about this more deeply in the discussion. My second point about developing standards for research management, research data management, concerns what the recommendations that are published in the practical guide to the International Alignment on Research Data Management. That was a practical guide published in 2019, providing a series of key questions, again, for research organizations, funders, and performers to take into account when developing research data management policies. Building on the evidence, we found out that the approaches and characteristics of the implementation of the RDM guide are very common. So there is clearly space for a common set of minimum or core requirements. And the key requirements to develop that in that coherent approach can be summarized in 3 keywords: collaboration within the organization and beyond the organization, to have become conscious of what the new policies on research data management entail; engaging with all actors concerned. What I mean by actors is not only the researchers, of course, the scientific community, but also the legal community, the financial community, and very importantly, the communication community. The last factor is the implementation. Here is where we recommend highly that research funding organizations and research performing organizations work together to provide sufficient support for researchers to feel on the right track when developing these research data management plans. That can take the form of training courses, online tools, direct assistance, etc. Each organization can see what is the best way for them to organize themselves to provide a good service to researchers. Follow up on this practical guide, we published January this year a set of clear examples of how members of Science Europe are implementing the research data management guidelines. So you are welcome to look at these as well. And now we are in a process of developing what we have called a data management plan evaluation rubric, which is a tool, will be a tool to assist researchers, to assist evaluators, to assist internal research data management staff to build appropriate research data management plans. And this will be added to the practical guide. This will be a new chapter to the practical guide that we have now. My last point, and here I'm joining the point that several of the other colleagues in this panel have highlighted, is the need for monitoring the implication of open science policies. These are now starting to be, I would say, common, and we may expect that they will explode, or that they will be there will be more and more open science policies being implemented. They are all expected to have an impact in the scientific and research ecosystem, which was, of course, what we want. But what we want to be aware is what are the unintended consequences, especially if they have any negative unintended consequences. There could be also unintended positive consequences. In any case, monitoring frameworks are needed to assess the impact. And for example, I can mention the implementation of Plan S. That there are 11 members in Science Europe at the moment committed to implement Plan S as of January 2021. And a monitoring framework is being developed to stay alert on the effects in several domains: on researcher employment and research evaluation, the ability to publish in the Journal of Authors' Choice, the costs and resources for open access publishing, the changes in the nature of the research activity, etc. There is a monitoring framework in the website of Coalition S, where you will find the details of all these framework aspects that are going to be monitored in the coming years. Now, when we think about research assessment, for example, as I said before, the challenges faced by research organizations are common. And what is very clear is that no one single actor, research performing, research funding, libraries, publishers, can solve or can address open science on their own. Concert and action is needed. And clearly there are fundamental aspects on the conduct of research that need perhaps some review by all of us to determine what kind of system do we want in the future. And with this comment, I would like to end my contribution.
Thank you very much, Lydia. That's great. Right, I will now pass back to Ava briefly, just for her comments from the position of Jeroen that she obviously has represented. And I just ask Ava if you're able to keep comments brief as possible. We've got lots of great questions in, so I want to try and have enough time to get to those too. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I will not use slides in this particular panel. I do really like to enjoy very much, and I just realized listening to you how much I miss you because it's super inspiring to listen to the other stakeholders, because we are in the same battle, in the same war, and I think it's super interesting to know how the funders are going to help the universities, how the young academies embrace my young researchers, and how the publishers commit with the research data is fantastic, because what I'm going to tell you about is what Jeroen has envisioned to do on open science regarding the recommendations in the last report. First, I would like to underline that the question that we have to be very conscious in the implementation of open science is diversity. Diversity of stakeholders, diversity of interest, diversity even inside an institution. Jeroen is the Young European Research University Network. It's formed by 17 universities, young universities, all of them in under 50 years old in Europe, but they belong to 12 countries, that they have 12 different policies. So sometimes it's very difficult to align, even within the same institution, even within the same organization, align the way that we proceed. It's not the same way we do in Spain, in the Universidad Carlos III, that we can do. My colleagues in Maastricht University, that they are under the umbrella of the policy of the Netherlands. So this is something that we have to bear in mind. And with this in mind, in Gerun, what we have done is absolutely embrace the final report of the Open Science Policy Platform, because we really believe in this system of sharing knowledge, and we really want to contribute to change the system of a sharing knowledge system. But also because we think that the universities, when you are young, it's easier to move forward. This is not really true, because the university is a dinosaur, but the young universities are young dinosaurs. So that's why we want to move with more speed the challenges and the changes that open science address. And in this case, what we want to do at the young universities in Europe is to do something that we have jurisdiction. I cannot change the policy of the 17 universities, but we can do something together. For example, in terms of reward system, we want to have a prize for the researchers that they are open science champions among the 17 universities, even if in each country they have different policies of research evaluation. And also we want to have pilots that can help us to address bottom-up initiatives from the community. And also we believe very much in young researchers. So that's why in Jeru, one of our practical commitments for implementation is to try to educate, to skill all our young researchers, early career researchers in open science, just to avoid the misconceptions that sometimes come into a conversation with a young researcher and a PI and a principal investigator. So this is a bit of what we want to do. This diversity of 12 countries, of 17 institutions, on young dinosaurs, and on very young universities that will really embrace the new shared knowledge system.
Thank you very much. That was quick, very good. Thank you, Ava. Right, we've got lots of great questions and not very long, so I'm going to try and cover as many of them as I can. I apologise to some of you that I suspect I won't get to them all. The first question that came in very early on, actually, but I thought was quite an interesting question and an interesting angle to think about, asks, in an era in which we discuss autonomous vehicles, why would one assume that researchers should be driven by a system of incentives and rewards? And is it worth thinking about a different approach? So I don't know if any of you in particular would like to take it. But if not, I was going to suggest, Ava, maybe you wanted to start.
I think it's a fantastic metaphor and a fantastic question. I do agree. But I think at the end, we need to put figures. We need to put to have. It's easier to have a line and follow the line that be creative and openly address research. So that's why the research system is based on incentives and rewards, and it's super frustrating. But there are some researchers that they really like that because they have a path and they don't have to think about what to do. The problem is that what I really want to change is the line. It has to be a line, but I would like to change the way that we motivate people. But perhaps it would be very nice to have an autonomous science, an autonomous mobile in this context too.
Thank you, Ava. I will, if there aren't any other comments on that, I will.
I was just going to say, I was just going to jump in. Why not? Why not?
Why not?
The only thing I mean, as my postgraduates in economics, I would be remiss to not say that incentives matter. And the other thing that we need to ensure is that we're observing actual human behavior and responses to those incentives. And I think we're probably a little bit further away from autonomous cars than I think is sometimes claimed by the manufacturers. And with all systems, you've got to be, I think, careful of what the impact of all incentives are, and if you bring in a new one, what will be the downside of it.
Thank you, Colin.
Right. Well, thank you for the question. I think, first of all, it's important to maybe not talk about researchers as a whole. I mean, there's like enormous diversity there. And of course, they're not driven by the same motivations, like they're not influenced in the same way by all these incentives. I'm happy to say that the people I'm mostly working with who are active in open science really do it not for the credit, because in many cases there is not yet credit, but really because it improves their science and because they're really passionate about the sharing. So it's in part because the science gets better, and in part because of the values that they attach to the work they want to do. But that being said, we are actually talking about changing a system, and then I guess we need to talk about still incentives as well.
Thank you. And Lydia.
Yes, thank you. Very shortly, just to say, indeed, Koen made a very good point here about the values. I think that the rewards and incentives, it's kind of a keyword, but they reflect somehow the values of a system at a certain point, and they induce behavior. And another aspect that we should be aware of these rewards and incentives is that normally they are kind of target to an individual. And perhaps we should think more of a group of individuals in relation to this kind of team science, which is becoming more common in the conduct of science. So there is a lot to reflect about the rewards and incentives and on the values of research for society.
Absolutely. Okay, so I'm going to move us on to the next question because, as I say, there's quite a lot of good questions here. So this one, I think, particularly is for Koen, but welcome others jumping in too. So this one says several early career research organisations like Eurodot, Marie Curie, Young Academy Europe, Global Young Academy are working in the Plan S task force. However, very often we see that these organisations' inputs are not taken into account by the funding agencies. One recent example being ERC withdrawing their support from Plan S, mentioning their concern for early career researchers, but without talking with these organisations. So what's the thought of the panelists on this?
Well, that's right. Well, at the same time, I think these organizations would say that other of the funding agencies and Coalition S is listening to their concerns. So I think we have a diversity, and I think these young scientist organizations play a crucial role, especially because they're very informed about open science. Usually they have open science working groups and so forth. So they are really part of this discussion. But on the other hand, I think it's important not to forget those scientists who are not part of this community, and they also have concerns. Now, these concerns may be in part based on misinformation, on confusion and so forth, but we need to also take them into account. So I think we all need to listen more broadly to the whole community of scientists. And I think that the ERC is in a sense listening to what the scientific societies are saying. Which again, we need to include them in the conversation in order to move forward. And I'm happy to say that we are actually in touch with the ERC very closely now, and the 4 organizations are talking directly with the Scientific Council of the ERC on these matters.
Thank you. Anybody else want to come in? Okay, I will move on to the next question. So the next question is really for Ian, I think. So several mainstream publishers, such as Springer Nature Publishing Group, are welcoming and committed to implementing Plan S recommendations, but we see a strong lobbying against Plan S by other publishers. At some extent, it can be termed as working against public benefit. How do we overcome this?
I mean, I don't recognise that at all from STM's membership, and it's certainly not the way the discussions go within our organisation. We are absolutely fully committed, and all of our members are committed. I think sometimes what are justifiable concerns about the lack of investment resource and lack of understanding of investment resource is portrayed as opposition, and I think we need to get beyond that. A lot of our members' investment goes in the first stages of selection, getting up to the authors of accepted manuscripts. Anything from 20 to 50%, depending on the member, of the investment is there. And I think sometimes people assume that doesn't exist, but even just the thought experiment of receiving thousands of submissions, having to read them and having to select the best from them, it takes time and effort. And that's an important part of the process. So look, sometimes the battle lines are drawn too simply. We will always stand up for the importance of the role that publishers play, and we will always stand up for the importance of investment in those functions, and they can be delivered in many, many different ways, not just by our members, but in all sorts of different ways. But please, let's have that as a discussion about the realities that are faced, and not a kind of an easy assumption that it's opposition. Members will move to open access journals when they can recoup the investment, and many are doing so, in very different ways. And in order to encourage more of that, we have to engage with that problem and not use it as an excuse to try and kind of portray a section of people as trying to avoid or oppose the objective. Ultimately, publishers will go wherever the researchers want to go.
Thank you, Ian. Okay, I would ask one last question before we need to wrap up. And this is quite a sort of general question, but I wonder if Michaela, you want to kick us off. So the question is, to what extent should we aim for cohesion? And actually, where should we encourage a diversity of approaches?
Maybe I would say that we need to find the right balance. No, we saw also in open science there are lots of differences between disciplines, and this needs to be respected. So I don't think we have been advocating at the OSPP for a cohesion on all the aspects, but also to recognize the diversities that we have. But for example, there are some areas, like we have been discussing different policies, no, at national level and the European level, that would be important to have some cohesions, still respecting the differences of each research system in the different countries. So I think it should be a balance.
Okay. Cohen?
Yeah, I would agree, Michaela. And I think OSPP is a great example of trying to strike that balance. I think 2 years ago, with trying to find really recommendations that could be implemented at the European level, clearly we need consensus. We need to build a consensus around that. But then if we start talking about the different ways of implementing, there's different ways of actually implementing these recommendations. And then again, I think diversity is probably very important to keep a lively ecosystem for scholarly research and publishing and data and everything.
Thank you. And Lydia, I think you wanted the last.
Yeah, just to add to these good comments about balance. That, for example, through the examples I have shown, in trying to identify common or core requirements for research assessment or for research data management plans, there is lots of room for personalization at disciplinary level, at institutional level, depending on the needs, requirements, and contexts. So there is not one or the other, but it is about finding a core set of common trends, also to give a solid base to the researchers, and to identify that despite of no matter what field they are researching on, there is a core common set of values or common set of guidelines, and that is important for the system.
Thank you, Lydia. Okay, I'm aware we've only got 1 minute left. So Ava, I don't know if you have any sort of last comment you would like to share with us before we close?
Well, in 46 minutes, I think it was very nice session. And we don't need, I think that open science is, the relationship about open science between stakeholders is like a love relationship. We don't need to look at each other. We need to look in the same direction. And I think this is a very nice conclusion of our final report. And we have to bet for a new science, for an open science in a collaborative way, when science don't answer questions, but science solve problems in this diversity and in this engaging situation and society that we have been facing lately.
Thank you. Thank you ever so much. Thank you to all the speakers. Really appreciate all your contributions, and thank you to the participants for the great questions. Sorry we weren't able to get to them all, but thank you very much for a really good discussion. Thank you for listening. Thank you.